Saturday, May 3rd, 1913. Of all the official people I consulted, not one of these experts doubted my story, and all had known similar cases. We do not need to be told that the people to whom these things happen, if they are refined and sensitive, are not eager to make known their ruin. The natural impulse is to cover the horror from every eye, even to deny it. Welcome to the Elizabeth Robbins Diary podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Kaler. In Season 1, Episode 4, we talked about Elizabeth's novel on human trafficking, published as My Little Sister in the US and Where Are You Going To in the UK. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, you'll want to go back and do that first, because this episode assumes the listener has a basic knowledge of the novel. Today, we'll discuss how Elizabeth's book was adapted into a silent film made by Fox Films in 1919. As controversial as the subject matter was, Fox's choice for the film's lead actress, Evelyn Nesbit, was even more controversial. Evelyn was the most famous face of her generation. Even though images of her are over 100 years old, most Americans today will recognize her beautiful face, even if they don't know her name. Evelyn is also remembered in history for her association with a 1906 murder that was dubbed the crime of the century. Although Elizabeth's film didn't specifically relate to Evelyn's life, bringing Evelyn into the film leads us to a wider discussion of human trafficking in America then and now. To understand Evelyn better, we're going to speak to Dr. Paula Yoroburo. She's the author of American Eve, Evelyn Nesbit, Stanford White, The Birth of the It Girl, and the Crime of the Century. Paula has her doctorate in literature and is a professor at Hofstra University for English and Film Studies. Hello, Paula. Would you please introduce to us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. Well, I'm now an emeritus professor at Hofstra University, where I teach literature classes, film studies classes. I teach in the women's studies program, and I've been doing that for 40 years. And I'm and I'm also a writer, and I've been working on another book.
So I don't know if I mentioned this when you and I talked the first time, but I had first read about Evelyn in college when I was interning at a Pittsburgh TV station. The guy that I was working for, Tom Green, gave me a copy of the novel Ragtime, and I totally devoured it and was really interested in it even more because I was in Pittsburgh, which was the hometown of both Evelyn and her husband, Harry. So that's what started me on my Evelyn track. What inspired you to research and write on Evelyn?
Well, it's funny. It's funny that you mentioned that because my first, I think, real awareness of Evelyn was in the novel Ragtime as well. And then I started, fast forward a number of years, and I was teaching, I was putting together a course that I was going to be teaching in the English department, which was I called it Daughters of Decadence. I was very interested in the writers and the women, the depiction of women at the turn of the century, the last turn of the century. And so I started doing research, and because I like to do visuals along with my writing, and I think it helps the students, get a sense of the period and the time. So I was doing research, and I kept coming across pictures of this one young woman, but they didn't, sometimes they didn't have a name. In fact, most of the time they didn't. And then as time went on, I started to see, oh, wait, this is Evelyn Nesbit. And I said, oh, wait a minute, I know it. Wait, Evelyn Nesbit, I know her. And then I started to do a little research. And one of the things that I do with my teaching, what I like to do is kind of demythologize things that I think need to be deconstructed. And so I started to be interested in finding out the facts of her life versus what was out there. And then like so many people with Evelyn, I became obsessed with her. And so that was the beginning.
That's great. So let's talk through a little bit of her career. When did she start working? What kinds of things did she do besides getting photographed without her name?
Yeah. Well, the thing about Evelyn is she had a relatively normal childhood, I would say, in the suburbs of Pittsburgh there. And then when her father died, she was only 11. He died suddenly. And her mother, who had not been trained to be anything but a good Victorian wife and mother, didn't know what to do and tried to run a boarding house, which was not very successful. And then she moved to Philadelphia with Evelyn, and Evelyn had a younger brother. And because Evelyn was sort of preternaturally beautiful, I mean, when you look at the pictures of her that you can find in my book or on the internet, she was just incredibly beautiful without any makeup. I mean, natural beauty. And so when she was 12 or 13, she was discovered by a woman artist who saw her. I mean, it sounds like, a Hollywood story, but saw her on the street and said, "Would you come model for me?" And she did. And then she began modeling for a group of women artists who were sort of an artist colony there in Pennsylvania at the time, in Philadelphia, which included some of the best known women illustrators for children's books, Elizabeth Shipman Green and Jessie Wilcox Smith. And then they all said, well, if as she got older, by the age of 14, 15, they said, if you want to make money, you should go to New York. So her mother took her to New York. Her brother stayed with family members back in Pennsylvania, and she became sort of, I mean, again, it sounds like a Hollywood story, but she became an overnight success as an artist model because they just couldn't believe her incredible beauty. And she was very much, this is the thing I think is the most significant. She was not typical of the period in the sense that she was much more modern looking. If you look at the picture of her on my cover, she looks like she could be, a model today. Right. And it was a real break from the Victorian sort of image of women. She was really the sort of going to become the face of the new woman. And so that's what happened. She became a model first for artists, and then advertisers began to take advantage of her looks. And she was on everything from postcards to pocket mirrors to fans and anything you can think of. She was in all the magazines. She became sort of the cover girl at the time. Mm-hmm. And that's what she did, at least initially when she came to New York.
Okay, so then she goes from being a face in still photography and in paintings, and then how does she end up on the stage?
The two things sort of came together because she said to her mother when she was 16, modeling was a pretty grueling job, and the fact that her mother was allowing her to model, even though it was for legitimate artists, it was still a pretty scandalous thing to have such a young girl modeling. Although her mother said she never modeled in the All Together, which I'm suspicious of. But when she was 16, she said, I want to go on the stage. So she got into the chorus of the most popular show on Broadway at the time, which was called Florodora. And that was where fate took a hand, and Stanford White became smitten with this little chorus girl that he saw from the audience, and saw the show 40 times and decided that he was going to pursue her as his next quote unquote protege.
Okay, which we will do in 1 second, but to get out of the way, this first thing first, she was a Gibson girl. So for people that don't know what that is, what does that mean, and why was she important in that role?
Okay, well, and it's funny because White was the person, in fact, who said to her, you shouldn't be modeling for all these old stiffs. What you need to do is model for some real artists. And he was friends with Charles Dana Gibson, who was a book illustrator, and he was famous for the covers that he did and the illustrations for Life magazine at the time. And his whole thing was depicting what he considered to be the new man and the new woman. And when he saw Evelyn, he immediately said, "This is the Gibson girl." And probably the most famous image of her is called The Eternal Question. If you go online, you can just put in Eternal Question and you'll see the picture of Evelyn. She literally became the face, the icon of the era, of the new woman. And it's interesting because it's such a transitional point between the old world and the new. And the question it was based on Freud's thing, what does a woman want? It's the eternal question. And so she became a Gibson girl, and it was really meant to be a representation of the modern sort of woman in Gibson's illustrations.
Okay. And I actually have a copy of Anne of Green Gables that has her on the cover, one of the originals, which is so funny to think of Evelyn and how her life went as opposed to Anne of Green Gables. But that's just a little side note. So back to Stanford White. Why is his involvement with Evelyn so important and probably the reason that people remember her today?
Yeah, well, what it was, the term I like now that I've sort of hooked onto is starchitect. He was the star architect at the time. There were other architects who were well known in New York at the turn of the century, but he was the sort of the poster boy for McKinmead and White, and he was this whirlwind. He had been a fine artist. He became interested in architecture, and he was busily sort of single-handedly transforming Manhattan from kind of the post-Civil War uh, dreary Manhattan to this, beautiful, shining new city of the new century. And he started doing commissions for families like the Vanderbilts and the Whitneys and the Goulds and the Astors. And he was running back and forth between Europe and here and giving, designing their mansions and filling them with like these opulent sculptures, and he had entire fireplaces brought over from Europe. And so he was kind of the bon vivant. He was the character, I think, that best embodied the spirit of the new century of progress. He was interested in anything new. He was friends with Nicholas Tesla and Edison, and which was an interesting combination. And so he really was a sort of a force of nature who was trying to transform the city at the time, while at the same time he was always very comfortable down in the lower regions of Broadway with the artist colony and the bohemian. So he lived in sort of both worlds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when I went to New York University to look at Elizabeth Robin's collection, you walk through the park that is there that he built, and his work is still around today, and he really did stunning architectural work, which makes it interesting to me that he had time for a 16-year-old. So let's get into that relationship.
Well, so the short version, I'll give you the short version. The short version is he started out acting very paternally towards Evelyn. This becomes a factor later in her life, not much later, but he invited her. He had another chorus girl that he was friendly with invite her to one of his snuggeries, these apartments he had around the city. At that point, he had already designed and built the Madison Square Garden across from the Madison Square Park. That was where the original Madison Square Garden was. It's not where it is today. And Evelyn came, and it seemed like a very innocent sort of get together. And he showed her this room that had this red velvet swing that he encouraged her to ride on and pushed her on, and she would go towards the ceiling, and there were paper Japanese parasols, and she would kick her foot through the parasols. And I leave it to the Freudians to think about what that might be. But and so for about 6 months to a year, he said, "Oh, I'm going to take care of you and your mother and your brother." And he sent your brother to a military school in Pennsylvania. He paid for their apartment. He furnished it. He started buying her all kinds of things. Her mother never seemed to question any of this, just thought it was whether or not she understood what was going on. I mean, today we would call it grooming, but nonetheless. And then one fateful night, Evelyn had been used to going to parties at White's at the Madison Square Garden Tower rooms. And then one night he said, "Oh, come after the show to a party." And when she showed up, meanwhile, she's 16 years old, and he's 48, and he's married, and he has a wife and son that live out on Long Island. And he said, "Oh, isn't it terrible? Nobody else has come." And then he said, "Let me show you another room that I have here." And so he takes her to this room, and not to give away too much, but I might as well. It's this a room with a mirrored ceilings and floor, and the bed is mirrors, and he gave her champagne. And the big question has always been whether or not he drugged her. That was what they claimed during the murder trial, or whether she just drank too much and passed out or didn't pass out. But the way I always talk about it is Evelyn described in her own memoir. She says, "I went into the room a virgin, but I did not come out one."
Mhm.
And that was the that was the beginning of the end of that was the start uh of the story that became, the crime of the century.
Yeah, so let's get to the part of how that turns into a crime. I mean, obviously, we would say it's already a crime, but we're going to end up in another crime involving a third party. So let's get into that.
Yeah, so in the midst of all of that was going on, while that was going on, there was another person who was a wealthy playboy was the term they used a lot. He was the heir to a $40 million fortune at a time when there was no taxes. So was Harry K. Thaw. His father had made a fortune in Pennsylvania post again in the industrial era. One of his sisters married one of the Carnegies, and he was a social climber, and he was determined he wanted to be part of, because everybody wanted to be part of New York society, not the society of Smoky City, as the newspapers used to refer to it. And he also saw Evelyn on the stage, and initially he started sending her notes and letters under an assumed name. And then one day went to her apartment, and there was a piano that was there. And she kept turning these things. She kept ignoring them because she was getting lots of what we would call, I guess, fan mail.
Yeah.
And then one day, she was asked to meet with this person who said, oh, I think you're the most beautiful girl in New York. And he says, I'm not who I said I am. I'm Harry Thaw of Pittsburgh. Now, I always tell when I talk about the book and various things, various functions and things, I say, it's like if you grew up in the shadow of the Kennedys and suddenly you're meeting one of the Kennedys, right? Because she had come from the suburbs of Pittsburgh there where the Thaw family was very prominent, and they lived in a mansion. And so, but she didn't like him. So she kind of put him off. And then really to fast forward, uh, and I still insist that his initial reason for courting her or trying to attract her attention was because he hated Sanford White. He wanted to desperately be part of the New York social scene, and he blamed White. Now, White was a member of a lot of the men's clubs, and he had designed at least probably a half a dozen of the most famous clubs, the Lambs Club, the Players Club, the Metropolitan Club, and Harry was blackballed from all these, but that was because he acted crazy.
Right.
And he was arrogant, and he was just a very strange character. And so he tries to woo Evelyn, um, and in the course of what happens, leaving out a lot of the details, but what happens is uh, White and Evelyn, he moves on to other young girls. And in the meantime, Harry starts to pursue Evelyn more aggressively. And I say in the book that the biggest mistake of her life, well, she made two big mistakes. The first one was she told Harry what Wyatt did to her. She had never told anybody, not her mother, not anybody. Um, and so for 2 years, she kept that secret. And then when she was with him on a trip that he had paid for her and her mother in Europe, they were in Paris, and she told Harry what White did. And that was kind of what he had been waiting for. At least that's what he said, but he didn't act on it. At the same time, uh, he still pursued Evelyn, and he said, no matter, despite everything, I want to marry you. And she kept putting him off because there's something about him that just was off-putting. I think that's where that term comes from. And so, but then fast forward to 1906. 1905, sorry. She finally agrees to marry him. Now, Evelyn is only 19 going on 20 at the time. She agrees to marry Harry Thaw, who is, the heir to this fortune. Harry's mother hated the fact that he was choosing a chorus girl. She wanted to marry her children off to, as she had with her daughter, to either royalty or somebody from another socially prominent family. But because the sun rose and set for her with Harry, so she reluctantly let the wedding take place. And then a year later, they were still sort of in the honeymoon phase, and they were going to go visit Harry's sister, the Countess of Yarmouth in England, when he announced we were going to stay overnight in New York, and then we'll leave tomorrow to go to Europe. And Evelyn had come to learn about Harry's absolute hatred of White. And so she was not happy that they were going to be in the city for any length of time. And the course of that night, the day and night, takes place, and Harry, they keep running into White or going to places that he was associated with, which Harry had always said he would never step foot in any building that White had designed and all of that. And so there they are that night, in June of 1906. They're on top of they're in the rooftop garden theater of Madison Square Garden. And just as the performance is ending in the theater, White had come in late, sat down to watch the opening night of this show, and Harry walked up to him and shot him 3 times, killing him instantly in front of 1,000 people. And that was going to become the most insane media circus for 2 years after that. And it was being called the crime of the century, the Madison Square tragedy. And the way these things happen a lot of times, even though Harry was the murderer and White was the victim, Evelyn becomes the focus of the trial. They keep publishing all of her modeling pictures in the paper, and she becomes known as she testifies to save Harry from going to the electric chair, since he clearly killed him in cold blood. She testifies, and she becomes known as the girl in the red velvet swing.
And what's so interesting, we talked about Theodore Roosevelt in episode 1. This is episode 2 of the season, and we're going to talk about him again. He was president at the time, and the coverage was considered so scandalous that President Roosevelt had to consult with the Postmaster General to find out if the stories were too obscene for them to have in the mail. And they ended up warning all the newspapers to be careful of what they printed, because they could be prosecuted for violating federal law for distributing lewd and lascivious material. So in addition to the pictures and the testimony, which they were sometimes doing word for word, is it true that the jury was sequestered and that this was the first time that it happened in the U.S.?
Well, and it's funny, that was what I learned back that's what I thought when I was doing my initial research. Subsequent to that, because the internet came into existence, but there were incidences, minor, no big trials, certainly, in certain places out west in various little towns. There had been, I guess, incidences of a jury being, sequestered, but nothing on the scale or magnitude of what went on. And this was the first time that a major trial, certainly in a major metropolitan city with such prominent figures, was sequestered because of what you just said. They needed it to try to keep the jurors from reading all of the newspaper accounts and being prejudiced in any way.
Yeah. So he ends up, I believe it was a hung jury the first time, and then he's convicted the second time based on temporary insanity.
Well, he's found innocent by reason of insanity, but and he is sent off to an insane asylum in upstate New York.
Okay. And then following that murder trial, how does Evelyn support herself?
Well, again, when I tell people, I said, all of this, everything I've just described to you, and you know this already, but happens between the ages when she's 16 to 21. So what do you do at that point? Because Harry is now in an insane asylum. Mother Thaw now has control of the money, and whatever money they might have promised her to testify to save Harry's life, she cut her off completely. So Evelyn now finds herself in the unfortunate position of having no money, having been cut off from her family. Her mother kind of abandoned her when the whole scandal started. Her brother had great affection for White, and he blamed her for White's death, which is really not fair. But so Evelyn at that point has to try to figure out what to do. So she tries for a couple of years to visit Harry in the insane asylum and ask him to, make sure that I get some money to live, because in the middle of all this, Evelyn 3 years after Harry is incarcerated in the insane asylum, she has a son, and she claimed that it was Harry's son, conjugal visit to the asylum. And so um, she then, for the next however many years, has a series of she tries to make a living. I mean, the obvious thing would be, well, what would you do if you're a model? We think of the term model slash actress. So she decided that first she tried, well, it was sort of again simultaneously. She tried to dance in vaudeville because she was apparently a fairly talented dancer. And she met a man who became her partner and became her second husband very briefly, but he didn't like being known as Mr. Evelyn Nesbit, so that didn't last very long. But she danced in vaudeville for a while. Then she went to Atlantic City in the early 20s and tried to establish a nightclub. And then when that didn't work out very well, she then tried to form a cosmetics company. She ran a tea salon on 57th Street in the city. And it was at that point when she started writing her memoirs, her first memoir. And then also she was approached to act in silent films. And that's, of course, where the connection with Elizabeth Robins, the actual connection, comes together.
Yeah, so we're going to skip to 1919 when Fox Films buys the right to My Little Sister, which is Elizabeth's novel. And I have a clipping from the Knoxville Journal and Tribune from April 6, 1919 that I'm going to read. My Little Sister, one of the best season's bestsellers, has been bought as a starring vehicle for Evelyn Nesbit, and Miss Nesbit will begin working on it immediately. My Little Sister was written by Elizabeth Robins, one of the best-known English authors. Negotiations for its purchase were conducted by cable with Miss Robins, who is in London. Not only has My Little Sister had a successful sale as a book, but in an abbreviated version, it appeared in magazine form. In speaking of the purchase of the novel this week, an official of the Fox Film Corporation said, My Little Sister abounds in those elements which are best suited to Evelyn Nesbit's personality and her style of acting, and it will make an unusually good picture for her. When we read the book, we were aware of this and at once got into communications by cable with Miss Robins. Now you're going to love this part. Other photo play producers were also after the book, we learned, and the price was set at a figure considerably in excess of what is usually demanded for a book. Because it was such an admirable vehicle for Miss Nesbit, however, we paid the prices gladly and are confident that we have obtained a story that will give Miss Nesbit greater opportunity than she has ever had on the screen. The widespread popularity which My Little Sister obtained in book and magazine form will be a direct benefit to exhibitors who will show this picture. People who have read the story will want to see it on the screen. Those who have not read it but have heard of it will want to see it because of its popularity. And I thought that was just such a great story, and also gives a little bit of insight into the fact that they were doing it on purpose for Evelyn, which I did not.
Yeah. I never knew that. And in all my research, I never came across that. But my holy grail is to try to find My Little Sister in any of the films that she did. She did about a dozen films, and none of them exist. None of them have been found.
Mm-hmm.
They may be in a reel in a barn in Pennsylvania somewhere, but so far I have only been able to see lobby cards and stills from the film. But that's fascinating.
Yeah, I'll send you the link to that when we're done. When Fox released their film version, Evelyn was 35 years old and Elizabeth was 57, which puts them a generation apart as actresses. But they both had worked in New York. What sorts of differences in the New York stage would Elizabeth have experienced in the 1880s than what Evelyn was experiencing in the 1890s and the 1900s?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, in the 1880s and into the 90s, they talk about the gay 90s and the Belle Epoque and all of that stuff. Again, the stage was considered fairly scandalous because it kind of broke down into the burlesque, the pre-vaudeville burlesque kind of, theatrical productions, and then legitimate theater when you think of people like Sarah Bernhardt, for example, and Elizabeth Robins. And in fact, Elizabeth Robbins, would have been considered a legitimate actress, but the roles that would have been available to her would be the sort of classics, like either the older classics or
Yeah.
Ibsen, that kind of thing. And so there was such an aura of respectability and to that, and I think that was would have been the reality for her. When you fast forward to Evelyn and the turn of the century and the sort of quote again, the sea change that was happening, which was happening pretty quickly, was going from sort of the Victorian notions about what women were allowed to do and supposed to do, and much more towards a modern sensibility. Although the Victorianism hung on pretty tenaciously, Evelyn, the theater changed from, you still had legitimate theater, you still had somebody like Ethel Barrymore, for example, Maud Adams, who were still doing serious plays, melodramas and serious plays and classical plays. But then you had this other subset, kind of the way it is now, popular and musicals, which of course Evelyn was in Florodora, which was one of them. And so there was a real split between what was considered legitimate theater and what was much more popular entertainment, and aimed much more, I think, at the influx of the immigrants that were coming in, sort of like the same thing with the Nickelodeon, popular entertainment versus what would be more considered, I would say, highbrow.
And then how does that then change when you're bringing film into it?
Yeah, well, that is a good question too, because when the films that Evelyn did, and My Little Sister actually is the one I really want to see, because it's one of the films that she did that has a serious social message attached to it. One of the things that happened, and I think clearly what they were doing with Evelyn, I don't know how much of it was people who were approaching her. Listen, this is the new thing. I will say that I don't have any evidence of there's no film of her either dancing. And there's one snippet of film of her singing when she was in her 30s and had gone through some rough times, her late 30s, which is on YouTube, and we can reference that later maybe. But but silent film was perfect because it didn't matter what she sounded like. The acting this early in film, in the early teens, and her first film was 1914, Threads of Destiny, which was shot in Fort Lee, New Jersey. They were all films that were, even the titles alone, you can tell they were trying to capitalize on her notoriety or her infamous, her fame or her notoriety, depending on how you want to look at it. Now, again, based on what you said, Elizabeth Robbins, I think, thought that My Little Sister was a good vehicle for her because it was, in fact, the synopsis of the film, which I have never seen, but that it's about the trafficking in white slavery, and Evelyn plays a kind of heroic role of somebody who tries to save her sister. They're both captured by white slavers and all of that. And so that was one of the few roles, I think, where she was depicted as I would say heroic, for the lack of a better term, because in other films that she did, in fact, the films she did the same year in 1919, she did 3 other films that same year. And if I just tell you the titles, A Fallen Idol, Thou Shalt Not, Woman, Woman, and then the year before was I Want to Forget, Her Mistake. So there are all these titles that indicate, some sort of Magdalene figure or Scarlet Letter or a small town girl who's ruined by her exposure to big city. So that was, I think, the attraction. Well, certainly for her, it was a way of making money because her son even appeared in a couple of the films with her as a little boy.
So in recommendations to the theaters showing the film, Fox Films actually suggested that the marketing downplay Evelyn's involvement. Why might Evelyn have been considered problematic for the film?
Evelyn would have still been known as this sort of scandalous, wanton woman, once the myth takes over, it's like when the legend becomes reality, print the legend. And so I remember when I was interviewing her daughter-in-law, and she told me the story about how when the Girl in the Red Velvet Swing was being made and then was going to be playing at the local theater, her grandchildren didn't know anything about her scandalous past. They were all in like grade school, grammar school, and they were worried, oh, should we tell the kids about who grandma is? And so they actually said, well, we want to go see this film, but we're so embarrassed. We don't want anybody to see us. And, the association with this scandal, because it really was a very conservative time in terms of morality. And, if you go back to the late teens, early 20s, suddenly the pendulum has swung from the roaring 20s to the very staid 1950s. And so her daughter-in-law said, well, we decided we'd wait until the lights went down, and then we went into the theater, and then the lights came up, and I looked around, and they saw all their neighbors and all their friends, and they saw them. Wow. So yeah, but I think that would have been the reason.
Yeah. Well, and my son Andrew and I actually watched The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing Sunday night. He found it somehow on the internet, and it was 1955. And what I thought was really interesting was that they definitely portray Evelyn as an adult instead of a 16-year-old. And right. She is very much portrayed as the aggressor in the relationship with Stanford. And I understand, she was an advisor to that film, but I think it brings up interesting conversations about how sexual abuse was viewed in the early 1900s, how that was viewed in the 50s, and then even between when your book was written and how we look at things today. I would be interested to hear from you how you see that having changed in society.
Yeah, well, it is interesting because, in fact, I remember when they wanted to give the title of the book was they mentioned the It Girl, and I said, the It Girl was Clara Bow in the 1920s, but okay. And so I felt compelled to add something in the book that Evelyn was the It Girl before anybody knew what it was or talked about it, because everything was sort of,
yeah.
The French postcards were scandalous, and there was a Society for the Suppression of Vice. And so when Evelyn becomes the notorious Girl in the Red Velvet Swing, I sort of alluded to it before. She was the one who was being initially branded as the cause of this murder, and it was because of her siren-like beauty. And, I've actually, when I was doing my research, I had people say to me, oh, well, she pitted one man against the other. And I said, where are you getting this information from? Yeah. That was not the case at all. And so from that, first you have this, even when the trial was happening, you had this attempt by the yellow journalist to try to blame her somehow, blame the woman, this sort of Eve, Pandora, Lilith, go through the list of women historically who become the reason for Helen of Troy, whatever list you want. And then luckily, the Sob sisters were the group of women journalists who came to sort of her defense, now they tried to depict her not as the vixen, but as a victim, which is equally, problematic in so many ways. And I remember when I was reading through all the research, and I thought, well, God, if this is going to turn out to be a really story of somebody who's just victimized her entire life and never succeeds in anything and is, I will feel terrible. And I don't know that I want to tell that story. But then, so you fast forward, and when they got to the Girl in the Red Velvet Swing, and I was never able to find out through either any interviews that I saw. I had a lot of the press materials from the movie, The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing, and I talked to her family, but they didn't want to talk about the past anyway. And so, and I had read letters. A collector, a friend of mine, has over 600 letters that she wrote when she was in her 70s and 80s. And she didn't really talk about the details of anything like that. But my sense of it was that they wanted to sanitize the whole thing because certainly in her own memoir, she talks about being naked on the red velvet swing and being naked and riding around on Sanford White's shoulders. And in the movie, it's all very 50s sanitized. It's a product absolutely of the time. And White, it's depicted as some sort of unrequited, this love story. And in the end, she feels she has to apologize to his wife, and she's, the last thing is her in this sort of seedy nightclub or theater where she's on this swing, uh and it was just it was of the period, and no one ever there was no hint that White at all was at fault. And because she didn't look like a child,
Yeah.
you know, it changes the whole dynamic of it. And Harry Thaw was sort of depicted as the crazy person that he was, but again, didn't seem much older than Evelyn when he was actually twice her age as well. So fast forward to now, the terms that were used at the turn of the century, the seducer, they called White a libertine, which is a very sort of mild term for what I think he ultimately was. Now, people like to use the term pedophile, and technically there's a different term for men who like adolescent girls, which is what I think was his predilection, and it was nobody knows it, but it's called hebephilia. But so I wouldn't say that he was a pedophile, but he certainly liked these teenage chorus girls. Harry Thaw at one point in one of the legal documents said that he had seduced and ruined at least 348 young girls. I don't know where he got the number from, but that was the number he'd had.
Well, and it was very clear that Stanford had set up his life in a way to attract them and also to, help them with their careers in exchange for what he was getting out of it. So I was disappointed in the fact that he kind of came across as this oblivious old man who accidentally fell in love with this girl and not a serial predator.
Yeah, no, it was outrageous. It was outrageous. And it's interesting because in the film version of Ragtime, you don't get anything about that. You just see him being killed. Now it's funny. I've shown that film, and people who've read my book, they cheer when Stanford White gets shot in Ragtime. But the fact is, if I looked at it now, looking at it now, the way that you said that the language and the whole attitude, Me Too, is a huge factor in all this. But what we see now is behavior. His behavior was grooming, grooming these young girls. He obviously picked girls who either had parents or who were neglectful of their daughters, or who were absent totally, or in this case, girls who didn't have fathers, who were, again, father, wanted father figures and were confusing, the kind of paternalism that he initially showed them to whatever happened afterwards. The one thing I will say, so there's this, what I would call what happened with Evelyn was date rape, which isn't even, date rape is almost not a good enough word, because it's not like they were on a date, like, with equivalents. He was this man of incredible wealth and power and fame, and was 3 times her age, and was plying her with champagne. So that's the way to view it. That's the lens now, not the one that was certainly not depicted in the 50s film, and not the way it was even talked about at the turn of the century, where the terms, the ideas were actually closer at the turn of the century to what I see now, but they were using these sort of euphemisms, like libertine. And then Harry Thaw, it's weird to me. It's always been a strange thing to me. And someone asked me this once, did any of these young women that he had, quote, seduced and, whether they willingly or unwillingly engaged in sexual relationship with him for whatever amount of time, how is it that none of them ever blackmailed him or any of this? And I have no answer for that, other than the fact that either, according to Evelyn herself, he always took care of these women that, she suspected might have been former, again, the terms that she uses, flames of his or whatever. Whereas Harry Thaw was depicted as the, quote, playboy, when in fact he was actually a sexual sadist. And I talk about in the book, one of the things that there's a whole sequence of things that he did with Evelyn. Despite everything that White did, I think Law was a much darker figure in terms of his relationships with women, his sort of psychotic behaviors. And they just talked about him as this, oh, the eccentricities of the rich, you know. He could get away with, bringing young girls to apartments he had, claiming he was going to help them with their theater career, and then beating them with dog whips and scalding them with boiling water. And I mean, this is the kind of stuff that he did. And even with Evelyn, after they got married, when she mentioned one day that he had paid for some dental work that she had done, that was because he said she was perfect except for this one little chip in her tooth. And Harry insisted that she go immediately to his dentist and have all of the work undone. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about it's terrible going to the dentist now. It was 10 times more terrible at the turn of the century when they didn't have electric drills and things like that. So that was the kind of sadistic behavior that he engaged in. And it's just it's never addressed. It's always I will tell you that when my book came out, I still had people saying, oh, well, she was this little Lolita. And I said, have you ever read Lolita? Do you know what Lolita is about? Mm-hmm. The novel is actually about a man who is this monstrous character. Whether you have any sympathy for him at all is because of Nabokov's genius as a writer, but it's about a man who's having sex with a 12-year-old girl and has a predilection for girls. So, this idea that that term, I mean, my own students don't know what it means. And unfortunately, I live on Long Island, where we had the case of the quote Long Island Lolita, right? The young girl, Amy Fisher, the teenage girl who shot her boyfriend's wife, who thankfully survived. Joey Buttafuoco, that was a huge thing 20 or so years ago. And the term they called was Long Island Lolita. And again, the same dynamic. They were trying to say that it was the girl's fault when it was a married man who was cheating on his wife, who was 2 or 3 times her age, So I think the Me Too movement has put these things in the forefront in a way that was absolutely necessary and, a long time in coming, but it still happens. And the popular culture just, ignores sometimes the reality. They prefer the myth to the reality.
Yeah, and I think as different as Evelyn and Elizabeth would have been perceived in their lifetime, there actually are a lot of parallels. And the deeper I got into your book, the more I started seeing them. And I listed a couple of them out. Both of the women were very clearly intelligent, and they loved learning and loved education. They both actually looked at Vassar College, but instead began acting in New York in their teens. They both had to make money to financially support themselves and their families from a very young age. Both married in their early 20s and had very short and very unhealthy marriages. We haven't talked about Elizabeth's marriage yet in the podcast, but her husband is going to commit suicide 2 years into their marriage. And he was really abusive and manipulative. And of course, Evelyn's husband ends up in an institution after his murder conviction. Right. So not marriages that ended well. And then both, though, end up maintaining really long careers after the tragedies with their husbands, which I thought was really interesting to see how they reconfigured their lives. What was it about Evelyn that kept her in front of the public and starting all these businesses that you referenced and continuing to try new ventures after she'd been so infamous?
Yeah, well, it's funny because I mentioned that there were letters that she wrote, and one of my favorite phrase, I think my favorite phrase of anything that I read that she wrote herself, and her letters indicated a very intelligent woman. She was the fact that you mentioned too, that she and Elizabeth were both, the intention was to go to Vassar, and Evelyn was described by family members that I interviewed as being a voracious reader, and she continued that to the end of her life, and she read everything from Madame Blavatsky to Jack Kerouac, and I mean, just Russian. She loved Russian novels, so she was not just preternaturally beautiful when she was young, but also precociously intelligent. But and as I've said to some people, there's intelligence and then there's emotional immaturity, which everything that happened to her happened at the age of, from the age of 13 to 21. And I always say, think about yourself at that age. How wise were you in your decisions and the things that you did? At the same
Your
time,
brain is not even fully developed.
exactly. At the same time, she had this incredible, I think, survival instinct as well. And maybe that was because when her father died at such a young age, she and her mother and the brother had to find ways to survive. And so, um, and I always think, I think one of the worst things for me is the image that the image that I got from family and from things that I read. Uh, Her mother was constantly, saying, "Oh my God, we're going to the poorhouse," and that kind of burden to put on a young child or children, I think, uh, you can go either way. It can scar them in certain ways, or it can push them into a sense of, well, I'm not getting any help here, so I have to become self-reliant. And I think the other thing that happened, of course, was the fact that she's a single mother essentially. In From 1910 on, she's a single mother at a time when there's really no social services for women, and there's no, so she always wanted the best for her son Russell, and so she was constantly trying to find ways to make a living for her son. I mean, that's really what it was. But unfortunately, she also succumbed to drug addiction briefly, and a suicide attempt as well. And so, but the thing is, she survived it all. And the phrase that I said that I love of hers is when people have asked her about the past, she said, "You mean when I rocked civilization?" And that to me is sort of an indication of her attitude. By the time she was in her 60s and 70s, she had dismissed it all as, "Oh, well, that's just the way that I had to make for myself," which again is, I think it's interesting that she played that Elizabeth Robbins saw her as good for this, what I would call a heroic character or brave character in My Little Sister, because that to me is what she ultimately was. She was a free spirit, she made bad choices. I mean, she was taken out of school at the age of 11, so she didn't have a formal education, but she was incredibly intelligent. The things that she wrote, if you read her memoirs, just sort of, a unique and a unique character person.
Well, and I think if we want to put it in honest terms, I don't think anybody could honestly deny that she was trafficked herself by her mom. I mean, either her mom was completely naive, but like, who buys apartments and pays for people's schooling and does all of these things without something in exchange? So I love that they picked somebody who had been trafficked, although in a different way. She wasn't kidnapped, but right. She was trafficked. And I thought it was interesting that was the choice to make that the lead in the film.
Yeah, I think so too. And now I really want to try to find the film, but absolutely, and I've talked about the book, and about Evelyn's story. I always talk about, it's funny, depending on what decade we're talking about. I remember talking about Brooke Shields and Lindsay Lohan and Britney Spears and even Drew Barrymore, these young girls who had virtually no parental guidance, or they had parents who lived off of them and took advantage of their youthful innocence and and in every case, their beauty and their whatever talent they had. And it's just, it's so obscene. That's why I said, this is a story as much about monstrous mothers as it is about a whole lot of other things.
Yeah, and I think, too, when you look at both Evelyn and Elizabeth, you see that they managed to maintain some agency, even though there's lots of things that we can point to and say, well, that doesn't seem like an active agency. But they did seem really determined to maintain some control over their own story, even in ways that we might not necessarily think were the greatest ways to do.
Well, no, yeah, I agree, because I know that Elizabeth, right, she kept diaries her whole life. And I think Evelyn wrote her life story early on in 1917, right after Harry was put in the insane asylum. And then she wrote it again in Prodigal Days in 1936. And then she serialized it in the Daily News. And the thing is, she was trying to get control of her narrative.
Yeah.
You know, you could see her trying to get a control of her narrative and be honest, but also tell it from the perspective of the person who lived it, and not all the stupid yellow journalism and all the kind of stuff that went on subsequent to that.
And people trying to make themselves feel better about their own complicity or bad behavior.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. I mean, it always outraged me that because her mother abandoned her at the worst moment when she was all by herself, which again is another thing that Harry thought, that he was a groomer, because he did the thing where he separated her from her family and any friends. So she had no friends or family when she married him. And for that whole year, she was sort of a prisoner in this mansion in Pittsburgh. And her mother got married, remarried. And when the murder happened and the reporters sought her out, she said, I don't know Stanford way.
wow.
So I found that absolutely awful as well.
So obviously, if somebody wants to learn more about Evelyn, they need to read your book, American Eve, which we will put a link to in the show notes to help people find it. But besides the book, what is a resource that you would most recommend?
Well, it's funny because the most recent one, Simon Batts did a book, The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing, and it's very good. It's very well researched. It's more heavily, I would say, more involved in the legal aspects. You know, the same story, but then the trial and the intricacies of what went on during the trial. But it's also a very good book. I mean, I would say, if you really want a sort of revelation, the two books I would recommend, if you could find them, but it's very hard. Sometimes they pop up on eBay and places, or is her own book, Prodigal Days, which is the memoir she wrote in 1936. And if you want an insight into a crazy mind, Harry Thaw wrote his own book called The Traitor in the 1920s. I think it was 26.
Traitor is in Traitor?
Yeah, Traitor. And in fact, when it came out, everybody assumed that referred to Evelyn or White's, but in fact, it refers to his lawyer at the time, who he felt betrayed him by going with the insanity plea and not some other defense, the defense of womanhood, the dementia Americana that they tried with the first trial and failed with. But those are two books. You know, it's funny. There's an artist named Rick Geary, Geary, and he actually is so good at getting to the heart of a narrative of stories and doing kind of like a graphic novel illustrated version of things. He did one, the Madison Square Tragedy, which is very good because he's always got his facts right. And I mention that because he's also did one on Lizzie Borden, which is the book I'm finishing now. And so I really like his work, and it's actually cuts out all the nonsense and gives you a really nicely condensed sense of the story.
That's awesome. Now you've given me more rabbit trails to go down. Thank you very much. But I have really loved talking to you. And this is our second conversation, and I know the audience is going to love it, and just really look forward to get this content out to people.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it too, and I have to try to figure out how I can, I don't know, find these silent films. You know, it's frustrating to me because given her popularity, you have to think that there must be copies of these films out there. But at the same time, I've always maintained that Mother Thaw somehow tried to get rid of anything that was associated with Evelyn and her notoriety. I mean, when I was doing the research, I actually got a hold of the 6,000-page transcript of the first trial, and you cannot find the transcript anywhere. I've looked for 20 years for the transcript of the second trial, and the fact is, I think because that was the one where Harry was declared insane, and I think that her money and power, she just had everything destroyed.
Well, thank you for 20 years of research and for everything you did find. And, I know we get kept up at night, but what we still can't find. But you found plenty, and definitely we need everybody to read that book.
And thank you very much. I look at Elizabeth uh, as somebody who is a role model, because of the way that she lived her life and the things that she achieved. And so it's nice that there are people keeping those stories alive and bringing them to the public because, what was it Virginia Woolf said? Throughout history, anonymous was a woman. So it's nice to know that there are these stories that could be inspirations for young women who don't know them because they've just never been focused on or told.
Well, thank you very much. That's very kind.
Okay, well, thank you.
Evelyn and Elizabeth, both extremely well known in their lifetime, navigated really tough childhoods. They attracted attention for their natural physical beauty, and they impressed people with their intelligence as young women. Yet both chose a life on the stage instead of an academic one. They were also both pursued relentlessly by many men. And like Evelyn, Elizabeth eventually agreed to marry a man she had turned down repeatedly. But that is a story for another podcast. Thank you for listening to the Elizabeth Robbins Diary podcast, which is made possible with the help of the brilliant minds of our guest experts like Dr. Yora Bureau. Besides being an excellent host, her name is a palindrome, and that is not a term I get to use very often. Would you please consider following and rating the podcast? By following us, you'll be sure not to miss an episode, and rating is a super helpful way to spread the word and support all the hard work of the following people. Leif Thomason of Odd Life Studios produced this content as well as editing, mixing, and mastering it. Elisa Babor and Barry Mindel of Roots Creative Code designed an easy-to-navigate website and our lovely graphics. Go to the website for links about Evelyn and even a My Little Sister movie poster. Randy Olson of Live Oak Theater wrote and performed our beautiful theme song, Time is Whispering. The GFWC Historic Brooksville Women's Club. That's where we recorded our interview with Paula today. Thales Library of New York University gave me access to Elizabeth's collection. Those resources are quoted with the kind permission of Independent Age. Find out more about them at independentage.org. Elizabeth's biographer, Dr. Joanne Gates. She and I had many conversations about My Little Sister since last season's episode aired. As always, her insight is invaluable. Check out her Elizabeth Robbins web at jsu.edu. And of course, Elizabeth Robbins and Evelyn Nesbit. I don't know if they ever met, but I sure would have loved to have listened to a conversation between the two of them. I hope this episode gets us past their celebrity personas and provides insight into their personhood. It's an honor for me to executive produce, write, and host this telling of their story.